The night before his first day as police chief, his own department handcuffed him to a table. Marcus Dean had been inside hundreds of police stations in 31 years of law enforcement. He knew how these buildings worked, and he knew exactly what they looked like when they didn't know who they were looking at. The Wednesday evening before his official first day as chief of police for the city of Carlton, Marcus walked into the main precinct in plain clothes. No badge, no announcement. He wanted to see the building operating in its ordinary state before anyone knew what he looked like. What happened in the next 2 hours was not what he had expected. By the time Marcus Dean was sitting in the processing room with his left wrist handcuffed to the table bracket, a sealed City Hall appointment letter, his name, his title, and his start date of the following morning, was sitting in the breast pocket of his overcoat, 6 inches from the desk officer's line of sight. Marcus had not mentioned it. He had chosen not to. He wanted to know what this building looked like when it didn't know who it was looking at. If you've ever wondered what a future police chief does when the building he's about to run handcuffs him to a table, subscribe and watch what happens next. The real story starts now. Marcus Dean had been inside hundreds of police precincts across 31 years in law enforcement. County stations, federal field offices, state bureau buildings, one converted textile warehouse in Bridgeport that still held its industrial smell under $2 million of city renovation. He knew how these buildings worked from the inside. He knew how the air settled differently near the evidence lockup, how the fluorescent light in processing corridors carried a specific quality that nobody who spent extended time in it ever grew entirely comfortable with, how the desk at the front of the lobby was always positioned to create a slight elevation advantage for the officer behind it over anyone approaching from the door. He had always been the person behind the desk, or the person the desk reported to, or the person who had designed the protocol the desk was operating under. He had never been the person walking toward the desk from the wrong side. On the Wednesday evening before his official first day as chief of police for the city of Carlton, Marcus Dean was wearing a dark gray wool overcoat, a white dress shirt with the top button open, dark trousers, and unremarkable shoes. He had no department badge because the department badge would be issued tomorrow at the official start. He had an appointment letter from City Hall in the sealed interior pocket of the overcoat. Carlton City seal in the upper left corner, the mayor's signature at the bottom, his name and title printed in the center above the start date. But he had not planned to produce it. His intention had been simple. Walk through the building once before anyone knew what he looked like. See the precinct in its ordinary operational state, not prepared for inspection, not performing for a new supervisor. He had told no one he was coming. The desk officer was a man in his mid-30s, square-jawed, looking up from the monitor as Marcus came through the glass front doors. Marcus placed both hands on the desk edge, unhurried, and said he wanted to check on the status of an administrative matter. The officer looked at Marcus across the desk with the expression of someone who had reached a conclusion before the sentence finished. He asked Marcus what the administrative matter was. Marcus said it was related to a personnel record. The officer asked if Marcus had an appointment. Marcus said he did not have an appointment. The officer said the records office was closed for the evening. Marcus said he understood and asked if there was someone he could leave a message with. The officer said there was not. Marcus looked at the officer. The officer looked at Marcus. The fluorescent light above the desk was neutral and flat, and it illuminated both of them with equal indifference. Marcus had parked 2 blocks away. The walk had been intentional. He had wanted the full approach on foot, the way anyone who came to this precinct on their own power, without a vehicle, without a badge, without the credential that made other credentials unnecessary, would approach it. The building was a standard civic structure, 3 stories of poured concrete faced with limestone-colored panels. The Carlton Police Department seal in black on frosted glass above the entrance. The entrance itself flanked by 2 light poles with department banners that were fading at the lower edges from the prior winter. He had stood across the street from it for 4 minutes before crossing. He had looked at the lobby through the glass, and counted the officers he could see, and noted their positions, and noted the desk, and noted the angle of the desk relative to the door, and understood immediately what the angle communicated to anyone approaching it without authorization. He crossed the street. He pushed through the glass door. He walked across the lobby toward the desk, and he put both hands on the edge of it, unhurried, and waited. Derek Holt was 6 years on the force. He had worked the main desk at Carlton's first precinct for 14 of his last 18 months. He had processed the full range of what came through a precinct lobby in a city of 400,000. Complainants, witnesses, attorneys, journalists, detached family members of people in the system, people having mental health episodes, people who were lost and needed directions to a different building entirely. He had developed, over 14 months behind this particular desk, a working intuition about what people who came through the front doors intended to do once they got there. He had applied that intuition to Marcus Dean approximately 1 second after Marcus walked through the glass doors, and the intuition had reached its conclusion before Marcus reached the desk. When the conversation about the records office reached its natural end and Marcus did not move toward the exit, Holt came around the desk. He asked Marcus if he needed something else. Marcus said he would wait in the lobby for a few minutes. Holt said the lobby was for people with business in the precinct. Marcus said his business was in the precinct. Holt put a hand on Marcus's right arm above the elbow. Not force. The degree of contact that is not force but communicates that force is available and is being withheld for the moment as a courtesy. Marcus looked at the hand on his arm, and then looked back at Holt's face and did not change his expression. There were 2 civilians in the lobby, a woman in a yellow cardigan at the standing forms counter, a man in a jacket in the waiting chairs. Both were watching. Marcus registered their positions the way he registered everything, as data, noted, filed in the appropriate location, available for later use. Holt said he was going to need Marcus to come to the back for a few minutes. Marcus said he would prefer to stay in the lobby. Holt's hand tightened on Marcus's arm. Marcus looked at Holt's hand one more time. Then Marcus looked at the processing corridor. Then Marcus walked in the direction he was being guided, without resistance and without hurry. The woman in the yellow cardigan had looked up from her form when Holt put the hand on Marcus's arm. She looked at it for a moment, not with alarm, more with the specific quality of attention of someone calibrating whether what they are seeing requires them to do something. She looked at Marcus's face. She looked back at her form. She went back to writing. The man in the waiting chairs had not changed position, but his posture had shifted slightly, the particular shift of someone who has decided to look peripheral. Marcus registered both decisions without judgment. He had spent a significant portion of his career learning to read those decisions, to understand what they told you about a room, and about what the room expected the people in it to do when they witnessed something they weren't sure about. The man and the woman had made the same decision that most people made in this room, in this lobby, in front of this desk. They had decided it wasn't theirs to intervene in. Marcus filed that observation in the same location he was filing everything else tonight. The processing room was a room Marcus could have drawn from memory, even if he had never been in this specific building. A table with 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the upper right corner, a second door that connected to the main corridor at an angle designed to allow movement through it without the person being processed, being able to determine which direction they were going before they arrived there. Holt sat Marcus at the table and used a standard department restraint to secure Marcus's left wrist to the bracket at the table edge. The restraint was loose enough to be medically unremarkable and tight enough to make the point the restraint was intended to make. Marcus set his right hand flat on the table. He looked at the camera in the upper corner. He looked at the surface of the table, which was laminate over particle board, scratched along the near edge by the accumulated contact of people who had sat here before Marcus. He looked at the wall. Holt had left the room to run the name through the system. Marcus could hear the specific quality of a precinct building in operation through the wall. The radios, the printers, the particular acoustic texture of people moving through a building who know where they are going and have authority to go there. Marcus had produced that acoustic texture for 31 years from inside the building. He sat in the processing room and listened to it from the outside for the first time in his life, and found that it sounded different from this side. Not worse, different. He began paying attention to the difference with the same quality of attention he brought to everything that was teaching him something he had not previously known. The door to the processing room had a small reinforced glass window set at eye level, the standard installation for rooms of this type, designed so that staff could verify the status of the room without opening the door. Through the window, Marcus could see the main processing corridor and a section of the hallway that connected to the records wing. He watched two officers pass through the hallway without looking at the processing room door. He watched a third pause at a bulletin board at the far end of the corridor and read something pinned to it for approximately 30 seconds before continuing. The fluorescent fixture in the corridor was newer than the one in the processing room. The corridor light was cooler and more even. The processing room light had a yellow undertone that Marcus associated with older installations, pre-LED. The kind of fixture that had been in place for long enough to have absorbed the specific quality of everything that had happened under it. Marcus sat inside that light and thought about what everything that had happened under it might have consisted of over the years. He thought about the complaint files. He thought about the numbers in those files. He thought about the gap between the numbers in the files and the numbers that never made it into files because the person who experienced the event had made the same decision as the woman in the yellow cardigan, that it wasn't theirs to report. The appointment letter from City Hall was in the interior breast pocket of the overcoat. The envelope was sealed. The city seal was debossed into the upper left corner of the envelope, raised edges, visible to the touch through the envelope paper. Marcus had felt it when he put the coat on that morning at 6:15 at his kitchen table while the coffee finished brewing. He had felt it again when Holt guided him into the processing corridor. He had felt it against his left rib cage through the processing room door while Holt secured the restraint. The letter had been there the entire time. Marcus had not mentioned it. He had a reason for not mentioning it that had been clear to him from the beginning and was still clear to him now. He had spent 31 years inside buildings like this one. He had written policies for buildings like this one. He had reviewed complaint files, use of force reports, civilian oversight board submissions, officer conduct reviews. He had read the data. He knew what the data said, and had always known what the data said. But data was a description of a pattern, and a description of a pattern was not the same as the pattern itself. And the pattern itself was not the same as being inside the pattern. He was inside the pattern now. He was sitting in the processing room of a building he was going to walk into tomorrow morning as its chief of operations, and no one in the building knew that yet. And Marcus was choosing not to tell them, because he wanted to know what this building looked like when it didn't know who it was looking at. The letter could wait. It had been waiting for 31 years. He had looked at those numbers every career stage he had ever reached. At sergeant, at lieutenant, at captain, at deputy chief. At each stage, the numbers had looked like a problem to be managed. He had managed them with the tools available to him at each stage: policy revision, training protocols, review board amendments, civilian oversight committee engagement. He had done the work conscientiously, and he had produced measurable incremental improvement, and he had been recognized for that improvement at each stage with additional authority. And the numbers had continued, not at the same rate, but they had continued. Marcus sat in the processing room of the Carlton 1st Precinct with his left wrist in a restraint and his right hand on the table, and thought about the gap between incremental improvement and the thing below the improvement that the improvement had not reached. The appointment letter in his breast pocket was the authorization to go below the improvement. He had 9 hours before that authorization began. He thought about the specific texture of that gap. The distance between a department that had improved its numbers and a department that had changed the underlying conditions that produced the numbers in the first place. He had never had the authority to reach the underlying conditions directly. Tomorrow, he would have that authority. He intended to use it. Holt was gone for 11 minutes. Marcus counted them in the specific way he had counted things in situations that required patience. Not with urgency, but with the same quality of attention he gave to anything that was telling him something. The table had been manufactured by a department furniture contractor whose name was stamped on the underside of the frame near the left rear leg. Marcus could see the edge of the label from the angle of his chair. The room had been painted in the last 18 months, possibly less. The overhead fixture had a slight flicker at the outer edge of the tube on the right side. The kind of flicker that was not yet a maintenance priority, but would be in approximately 4 more weeks. When Holt came back through the door, his face carried the specific expression of a man who has run a name through a system and received a result that did not confirm the conclusion he had arrived at when the person walked through the door. The result had not told Holt who Marcus Dean was, but it had told Holt something. Holt stood at the door and looked at Marcus, and the expression was cycling through several things in sequence. Confirmation that the restraint was still in place, reassessment of the situation, recalculation of the appropriate next step. Marcus watched the cycling. He had watched it in many faces in many rooms. He kept his right hand flat on the table and his left wrist inside the restraint, and did not offer Holt any assistance with the recalculation. The way Holt moved in the front of the car, the pauses, the specific keyboard cadence, Marcus could partially hear through the partition, told Marcus that Holt was not finding what he had expected to find. The name Marcus Dean returned a file. Every name in the city returned some kind of file if you knew where to look and had access to look there. The question was what the file contained, and whether what it contained told the person reading it something that changed their understanding of the situation. Marcus had been told by the mayor's office that the personnel appointment would be in the City Hall database by close of business Friday. 4 days ago. It was Wednesday. The file was there. Marcus had no particular concern about whether Holt was reading it correctly or at all. The math on the situation was simple. The file was there, and the file said what it said, and the building was going to arrive at what the file said on its own timeline. And Marcus's job was to wait for the building's timeline to intersect with the truth of the situation, which it would do without any assistance from Marcus. Holt was still standing at the door, working through the recalculation, when the secondary door opened. The woman who came through it was in her late 40s. Dark complexion, natural hair cut short at the temples, wearing a white dress shirt and dark slacks under an open blazer, a departmental lanyard at her neck with a gold shield at the bottom. She took in the room in approximately 2 seconds. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the restraint at the table bracket. She looked at Holt. She asked Holt what the situation was. Holt said there had been a lobby security matter. The woman asked Holt if he had run the name. Holt said he had run the name. The woman held out her hand. Holt gave her the printout. Captain Elaine Moss read the printout. She read it for approximately 4 seconds, which was twice as long as it should have taken to read a printout of that length. Then she set the printout on the table and looked at Marcus with the expression of a person who has just understood several things simultaneously and is organizing them in the correct order before speaking. She looked at the restraint. She looked at Holt. She said, "Derek, remove that." Holt removed the restraint. Moss looked at Marcus and said, "Chief Dean." The room became very still. The result that Holt had found in the system was not a criminal record. It was a flag attached to the name Marcus Dean in the city personnel database. The kind of flag that appeared when a name had been elevated to a tier of the system that the standard patrol access level could read the existence of but could not open. Holt could see that the flag existed. He could see the date it had been placed there and the department of origin, which was the mayor's office. He could not see what it said. The flag was the kind of thing that, if a patrol officer encountered it in the normal course of a records query, generated a second step, a contact with the supervisor on duty, who would have access to a lookup terminal at a higher clearance level. Holt had either not reached that second step or had reached it, and found that the supervisor on duty was not available. The specific expression Holt had been wearing, when he came back through the door, told Marcus the former was more likely than the latter. Holt had seen the flag. The flag had told Holt that something about the name he had run was attached to an authority above his access level. Holt had not known what to do with that information and had returned to the room rather than escalate it to someone who did. Marcus looked at Holt's face and read the sequence of this in approximately 3 seconds. Holt was still working through his options when the secondary door opened. What Holt did with that information in the next 30 seconds told Marcus something specific about Holt's decision-making process. A different officer in the same situation, one with a stronger instinct for the second step, for escalation when the situation was unclear, would have gone immediately to the supervisor on duty. Holt had instead returned to the room. That choice was a data point. Marcus filed it. Moss asked Holt to step outside. Holt stepped outside. When the door closed, Moss sat in the chair across from Marcus and placed both hands on the table. She said she owed him an apology on behalf of the department, and she was offering it now, formally, and it would be followed by a written report to the mayor's office by end of business tomorrow. Marcus said he understood. Moss asked if he had been physically harmed. Marcus said he had not. Moss said the dashcam in the lobby had been running since 1600. Marcus said he understood. Moss said the footage would be preserved in full. Marcus said he understood that too. He straightened his left wrist, set the hand flat on the table beside the right. The mark from the restraint was slight and would be gone within 20 minutes. Moss was watching his face with the specific attention of someone who knows that the thing they are looking at has more dimensions than they are currently able to see, and is making a disciplined effort to see more of them. Marcus found this quality of attention professionally reassuring. Moss had been with the department 11 years. He had read her file on Monday, along with the files of the other precinct captains. He had made a note about her in the margin of the command staff briefing document. The note said, "Retain." Moss had the specific quality of attention that Marcus had noted in the best officers he had worked with over 3 decades. It processed the room in a single pass and organized the information it collected in the correct priority order without appearing to do either. She had entered through the secondary door, which meant she had come from the records wing, which meant she had been in the building after hours on her own time, which meant something in the records wing had required her attention on a Wednesday evening when she was not scheduled to be on duty. She had been in the building, and the flag on the name Marcus Dean had reached her through whatever internal channel the flag was designed to activate when it was queried at the patrol level. She had come directly to the processing room. She had not stopped to ask Holt in the corridor what the situation was. She had come through the secondary door, seen the room, and understood the situation from the room itself. Moss picked up the printout from the table and read it once. She set it down. She looked at Marcus with the expression of a person who is currently in the process of holding several significant pieces of information in simultaneous suspension while deciding what to say first. She said, "Chief Dean." The room was very still. Marcus stood. Holt was waiting in the corridor outside the secondary door. Holt's face had arrived at an expression that was not remorse and was not defiance. It was the specific expression of a person who has realized that the action they took cannot be undone, and who has not yet determined what the undoing of it is going to cost. Marcus looked at Holt for a moment. He asked Holt his name. Holt said his name. Marcus listened to the name, the full name including the last name, and he did not write it down because he did not need to write it down, and he was not going to forget it. He said, "I'll see you at roll call, Officer Holt." Holt did not say anything. Marcus turned back to Moss. He said, "Captain." Moss straightened. Marcus put out his hand. Moss shook it. Marcus said, "This is exactly what we're fixing." Moss held the handshake for 1 beat longer than standard, and then released it. Marcus walked back through the processing corridor to the lobby. The 2 civilians were gone. 3 officers who had been in the lobby when the situation began were still there, in different positions than before. in the way that people reposition themselves when they want to appear to be doing something other than watching. Marcus walked past them and out through the glass front doors. In the parking lot, the evening air was cold and still. Marcus stood at his car for a moment with his hand on the door handle and looked back at the front of the building. The Carlton Police Department seal on the glass, the interior light behind it. He had 31 years of knowledge about what was wrong in buildings like this one, and he had a start date of tomorrow morning, and he had a list of exactly where he was going to begin. He got in the car. He drove home. In 9 hours, he was going to walk back through those doors, and everything after that was going to be different from everything before it. Moss handled the formalities with the economy of someone who understood that the formalities were both necessary and insufficient. She had the desk officer log the incident under her shield number. She had the lobby footage flagged for preservation. She noted the time of her entry into the processing room and the time of the restraint removal. And she noted both without theatrical emphasis, the way a professional notes things that need to be in a record, and that the record will be the appropriate place for their emphasis. When Holt had stepped outside, she had given Marcus space to sit in the chair across from her for a moment and say nothing if he wanted to. And Marcus had used that moment to look at the surface of the table and think about the 11 minutes he had spent sitting in this room before Moss had come through the door. He thought about the people who had sat here before him, who had also had something in their pocket that would have changed the conversation if they had produced it, and who hadn't produced it, not because they were making a considered strategic choice, as Marcus had been, but because producing it would not have changed what happened to them. He thought about that distinction for approximately 30 seconds. Then he stood. The corridor back to the lobby had 4 officers in it who had not been there when Holt had brought Marcus through it the first time. 2 of them were positioned near the water cooler at an angle that made them visible to the processing room's secondary door. 1 was at the bulletin board. 1 was coming out of the records wing with a folder. All 4 of them looked at Marcus as Marcus walked through the corridor. Marcus walked at his own pace, which was the same pace he had been walking at when he came through the glass front doors and placed his hands on the desk and began the conversation with Holt. He did not slow down, and he did not speed up, and he did not look away from any of them, and he did not speak. He walked through the lobby. The woman in the yellow cardigan was gone. 3 officers were standing near the desk. All 3 of them watched Marcus walk from the corridor entrance to the glass front doors. The glass doors opened into the cold evening air, and Marcus walked through them and stood on the sidewalk in front of the building and looked up at the sky for a moment, which was something he almost never did because it was almost never useful, but which was sometimes necessary in the immediate aftermath of something that required processing before the next thing began. He looked at the seal on the glass above the entrance. He had been chief of police for 11 days in name only, and he was going to be chief of police in fact beginning tomorrow morning. And the building behind him was going to undergo a period of significant change, beginning at the first staff meeting, and Marcus Dean had a clear and specific and sequential plan for what that change was going to consist of, and how long each element of it was going to take, and how he was going to measure whether each element had achieved what it was supposed to achieve. He had written that plan over the previous 11 days at his kitchen table at 5 in the morning before the city was awake. The plan was solid. The plan was built from 31 years of evidence. The plan had been sitting in the back of his mind for the last 2 hours as additional evidence had been added to it. Marcus walked to his car. He drove home. He set his alarm for 4:45. In the morning, he was going to walk back through those glass doors, and everything after that walk was going to be different from everything before it. The drive home took 22 minutes. Marcus drove in silence without the radio. He thought about the 11 minutes in the processing room. He thought about the woman in the yellow cardigan and the man in the waiting chairs and the decision they had both made. He thought about the 4 officers in the corridor when he walked back through it. Their positions, their faces, the particular quality of attention they had applied to watching him pass. He thought about Holt standing in the corridor outside the secondary door, with the expression of a man who had not yet understood the full dimension of what had just happened to him, but who would understand it gradually over the next several days. As the formal process unfolded, he thought about Moss. He thought about the handshake and what she had done with it. The one beat longer than standard. The quality of the grip, the specific way she had looked at him over the top of it. He had read 11 years of professional history in that handshake. He had read the history of a person who had been doing careful work inside a flawed structure for a long time, and who recognized in the quality of that handshake that the structure was about to change. He thought about what it was going to take to change it. Not at the margins, not incrementally, but structurally, in the places where the data said the structure was failing. He had the plan. The plan was built from the evidence. Tomorrow was the beginning of the plan becoming operational. Marcus parked in his driveway. He sat in the car for a moment. He looked at the house. Through the kitchen window, the light was on. He got out of the car. He went inside. He set the alarm. He lay down. He did not sleep immediately. He spent approximately 40 minutes looking at the ceiling and thinking about the morning.
What you just watched is fiction, but the world that made it feel real is not. A man walks into a building. He is not wearing a uniform. He is not announcing his authority. And the building reaches a conclusion about him before he finishes his first sentence. The question this story is asking, the question that history has been asking for a very long time, is what that conclusion is based on and what it costs. The data has an answer. According to the Stanford Open Policing Project, which analyzed over 100 million traffic stops across the United States, black drivers are stopped by police at significantly higher rates than white drivers. And when the stops are examined after dark, when the driver's race is less visible, the gap narrows. The daylight gap is not explained by driving behavior. It is explained by who the officer can see. The Stanford study is not an outlier. A 2013 report from the Department of Justice found that in the city of New York alone, over 500,000 people were stopped and questioned under the stop and frisk program in a single year. 87% of them were black or Hispanic. Less than 1% were found to have committed any crime. The pattern is not regional. The pattern is national. The pattern has a name, and the name is racial profiling, and it did not begin in the 21st century. The legal architecture of racial profiling was built long before any living officer put on a badge. After the Civil War, during the brief democratic experiment of Reconstruction, the Southern states passed a series of laws known as the Black Codes, statutes designed to control the movement and labor of newly freed black people. Being on a public road without proof of employment. Being in town without permission from a white employer, gathering in groups after dark. Gathering in groups after dark. These laws were enforced by the same men who had enforced slavery, carrying the same authority with different legal language around it. When Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow laws replaced it, vagrancy statutes became the mechanism. A black man walking without a destination that satisfied a white officer's expectation was a criminal by definition. The criminalization of presence had a legal foundation for nearly a century before the Civil Rights Act made the most visible of those laws unconstitutional. What the Civil Rights Act could not reach was the portion of the structure that lived not in the law itself, but in the daily discretion of those who enforced it. The law changed. The discretion did not change at the same rate. The inheritance of that discretion is the gap that Marcus Dean sat inside in the processing room. It is the gap between what the law says and what happens in the seconds before the law is consulted. It is the gap that a generation of black parents attempt to describe to their children in the conversation known as the talk. The conversation about how to behave when a police officer approaches, how to keep your hands visible, how to speak calmly, how to survive the seconds before the officer knows who you are. The talk exists because the gap exists. The data says the gap has narrowed in some places. The data also says that a black man is 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than a white man, according to a 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Narrowing is not closing. The woman in the yellow cardigan, who looked at the restraint and looked back at her form and kept writing, she made a choice that the historical record shows millions of people have made, in thousands of rooms, across many decades. Not out of indifference. Out of a learned understanding of what intervention costs and what silence costs and which cost falls on whom. What Marcus Dean carried into that processing room was 31 years of evidence about the structure he had spent his career working inside. The appointment letter in his pocket was the authorization to change that structure, not at the margins but at its foundations. The story of race and law enforcement in this country is not simply a story of individual officers making wrong decisions. It is a story of systems that made certain decisions feel like common sense for long enough that they became reflexes. Reflexes that operate in the seconds before the conscious mind has a chance to apply a different logic. The hard work of change is not the work of the appointment letter. It is the work that comes after, the slow, specific, unspectacular work of reaching the thing below the improvement that the improvement has not yet touched. That work has been ongoing in this country for a long time. It is not finished. The people doing it know it is not finished. They show up anyway.